What's up, y'all? Let's dive headfirst into today's stories. Background information: we live in an old and big manor that has been split into 3 attached houses. The houses are about 150 years old and were built around 5 huge giant sequoias which were about 200 years old. In the UK, giant sequoias are very rare, and the 2 in our garden up the house price by about £60,000. We lived next to 2 really nice neighbors, one young couple and one old couple. The story: unfortunately, our old neighbors passed away, so their child and her family moved in. Let's call her Jo. Jo was instantly a pain in the bum. We had been sharing chickens with the previous neighbors and Jo agreed to keep sharing them. However, on her nights she would constantly forget to put them away, so we would have to check them every night anyway. One night her little brats thought it would be funny to open our personal duck pen in the night, which leads to a mass slaughter later. The chickens went the same way. About 2 years ago there was a storm and one of her sequoias somehow fell over and died. They were distraught, understandably, but from then on, the jealousy started. She would constantly complain about how lucky we were to have 2 sequoias in our garden and how our sequoia was making too much shade in their garden. It wasn't. Anyway, we just thought it was Jo being a pain. There were a few dry threats like they will chop it down or maybe the next storm will blow it down. Until we came back from a holiday to France to find a huge 6-meter stump and nothing else. I mean, how the F do you get rid of a 100 feet tree in like 2 weeks? 2 of our old British oak trees had been crushed as well. My mom and sisters were crying, my dad were red in the face, and we had no evidence Jo had done it. She claimed that there had been a storm and she had to get rid of it. We had a security camera at the front of the house, but you can get in the back if you go through a few fields. We then were given an £8,000 bill for damages to her property, and to have the tree chopped up and remove the wood alone would have been worth a small fortune. We had lost all hope, and 2 weeks had passed when my dad came running in from the garden. We had put up a wildlife camera a few months ago and had caught everything. We got a lawyer on the phone and started our revenge. We got a tree surgeon out who said it was an original specimen brought into the UK in 1860 along with the 2 that were in Elveston Castle Country Park. There were 218 around the UK but only 60 now. He also told us to call out an engineer because the roots might be in the foundation, so when they rotted could damage the house. Turns out we would need to redo the foundations. Then we took Jo to court and sued them for damage to property, trespassing and lots of other smaller claims. The tree would cost $250,000 to have another sequoia that was 200 years put in and looked after. It's basically impossible, plus the damage to the foundation which was $200,000 and the 2 oaks which were another $25,000. So with the smaller claims, it went to about £500,000, $700,000. They had to move out. And we have now paid off the mortgage, done a lovely loft and kitchen conversion, and have basically done up the house and garden as well as plant a 60-year-old sequoia tree in the back garden. We also had our kitchen counter and table made from the old sequoia. We now have a new lovely family living next to us who we share chickens, ducks and pygmy goats with. They are very nice and I make a fortune babysitting their kids. I spent about 10 years teaching high school humanities at a small private school. For my first 2 years, I didn't have a classroom, just a small office. I would bring what I needed for each class on a cart and go from room to room, depending on which teacher had a prep at any given time. This was incredibly inconvenient and, not being the most organized of teachers to begin with, made things difficult to keep track of. There were a group of 11th grade boys who decided to make things a little more difficult for me. They were good kids, we got along well, I coached several of them on the school soccer team. But they decided that since my office would often be empty, it was a great place to prank. It was never anything too serious, things falling over when I opened the door, or things disappearing for a day and then turning up in a different place the next day. Nothing was ever damaged, and I could never prove who it was, even though I knew. My school had mandatory final exams in each academic course. I didn't really think they were necessary, so I would generally make them pretty easy with a lot of preparation. I would give out study sheets and play review games for a couple of weeks before the test, and there was no reason the students wouldn't do well on them. I had approval of admin to do this as they weren't particularly fond of the final exam rule either. It was a school board policy. A few nights before the offending boys had their exam, I had a brainwave. I created a second exam. Gone were the multiple choice questions and obvious things from the review sheets. In their place came detailed questions about concepts that were briefly mentioned in class. Essay question after essay question. Ambiguous questions with no clear answers. Definitions of words that there was no way they knew. It took a couple of hours, but I laughed the whole time. When the test came, I had the special exams at the bottom of the pile and handed them out to each of the 4 or 5 boys. I told my vice principal what was happening and he insisted on being present. I started the timer and watched as the boys flipped over their papers. It was all I could do to keep a straight face. Eyes went wide. Heads were shaking. Panic was setting in, especially as they saw all their classmates flying through their exams. One of the boys raised their hand. Sorry, no questions during the final. You should be prepared based on your study sheets. I let them go for about 5 or 10 minutes of terror before I gathered the fake tests and gave them the real ones. They all passed with flying colors and never pranked my office again. It was glorious. In college, my 2 friends and I decided to find a place together off campus. We found a beautiful 3-bedroom house with surprisingly affordable rent. The basement of the house was listed as a separate apartment, but as it had a separate entrance and the indoor stairwell had been blocked off, we weren't worried. And the thermostat was upstairs. Then the demon neighbor moved in. From upstairs, we could hear everything. This adult woman would call her mother and scream at her to pay for her cell phone bills and give her grocery money, aka Taco Bell and cheap tequila. She would scream at whatever guy she was sleeping with to bring her meth, and one day, she brought home 3 puppies to scream at, too. We were terrified of this woman, and the noise was hell. Also, we'd been idiotic enough to sign a lease stating we were responsible for all utilities, period. Meaning we were now financing her gas, water, and electric. But with only 2 months left on the lease, we thought we could just ride it out. But then she started smoking. Constantly. According to the landlord, she'd quit for good when she'd signed the lease, but for good only lasted 2 days. Since it was winter, the heat was running nearly 24/7, and the smoke was wafting up from the vents. Our apartment and all our belongings began to reek with smoke. We contacted the landlord, because we'd signed for a bloody non-smoking apartment. He told us we lived in a state where you could technically call an apartment non-smoking even if it shared ventilation with a smoking apartment. FU, leasing laws. At this point, my 2 roommates were heading out for a 2-week vacation. They were online students, while I was residential, leaving me alone in the apartment with the demon smoker in the basement. I couldn't sleep or eat because my idiotic stomach decided to react to all the secondhand smoke by aching and cramping constantly. After 3 days, I was a little insane. I made a plan. I checked the forecast, lows in the 20s all week. I borrowed a friend's ultra-insulated sleeping bag. I bought one of those ski masks with the holes for your eyes and mouth. I got out my stocking cap, my silk long underwear, my woolen socks, and my down parka. I bought tea, hot cocoa, and ramen, and prepared to live off a diet of hot liquids. And I turned off the fricking heat. Day 1, she's screaming at her mother for forcing her to move into this frozen poop hole of an apartment. Day 2, she's screaming at her boyfriend, meth-dealer, because he won't let her move in with him. Day 3, she's screaming at the landlord about how she's fricking freezing. Day 4, the landlord is at my door. I greet him in full ski mask / parka / stocking cap array, looking like I'm heading out to rob Santa Claus at the North Pole. He asks me if I don't find it a little chilly in the house. I reply I'd found all the cigarette smoke a little warm. Day 5, she's screaming about the beaches upstairs to anyone who will listen, and I'm sitting upstairs clutching my car keys and my pepper spray with 911 typed into my phone. She finally decides she's ducking leaving and moving in with Greg, even though he just got out for stabbing Travis, and he lives in that ducking creepy house in the woods with all those anus-biting dogs. Day 6, she's gone. I silently bless Greg. Moral of the story, there's a bloody reason the rent seems too good to be true. During the dot-com boom in the late 90s, I became somewhat well known for my expertise with a now somewhat obsolete networking technology. I ended up getting heavily recruited by a big telecom firm in Denver to run the technical side of a huge networking project they had underway. After multiple phone interviews, I was invited out for the big in-person sit-down, a 2-day affair where I met with the big dogs, other techies, HR, etc. It was a pretty killer opportunity. Took the trip. First day of meetings went great, I felt it was a great match, etc. I did sense there was some tension between 2 groups over network architecture, Turned out that was one of the reasons they were bringing in someone more senior who could finalize the approach and get the project moving. That was fine, all part of the job, whatever. Got wined and dined after the first day, was definitely feeling like the job was a match and that I'd be moving to Denver. Went in the second day, and after another round of interviews the division head takes me to lunch. That's when it all blew up. While we were at lunch, the firm's senior management canned the entire project and fired every person associated with it. Apparently there was a huge internal political war going on. This project was ground zero for the big battle and this division just lost. We get back from lunch and the manager escorts me to HR where we're going to sit down and go over their offer. Instead he's told what's going on and that he's out of a job along with everyone else on the project. At this point I was told to leave. No apologies, it was just pookie luck for me. WTF? Okay then, I'm gone. I get back to the hotel and there's a voicemail for me asking me to call the HR people. I'm pissed but I call. They tell me they've had to cancel my return ticket and that I'd need to pay for the hotel myself for now, but that if I would submit an expense report they might be able to get me a check. There's a second voicemail from the front desk asking me to provide a credit card for the stay. And then I get a call on my cell phone from the car rental company which I didn't answer. Turns out they also wanted my credit card. F that. I called the airline and they said my reservation had indeed been cancelled. They also acknowledged that the reservation was paid for using a fully refundable ticket, which I was holding and which back in the 90s was essentially as good as cash. Said they wouldn't know for certain if I could board until I showed up at the counter with the physical ticket. Great. Just freaking great. I'm on the hook for several thousand in airfare, nice hotel and rental car after taking several days of vacation from my job for this interview? I don't think so. I packed my bags and loaded up the rental car. Left the keys in hotel room door. Drove the rental car back to Dallas, stayed overnight in Amarillo. Dropped the rental at the Hertz lot at DFW Airport, took their shuttle to the terminal. I'd left my car at and drove home. Over the next few months I got several nasty phone calls from their HR and accounting departments demanding I pay them back for the trip, including paying for the $700 drop-off fee for the car. Never answered them of course, just let them go to voicemail. Eventually got a demand letter from their legal department, paid an attorney a nominal fee to send them a demand for compensation, threatened a lawsuit letter. Never heard from the firm again. Side note, the ticket itself was still valid. I ended up selling it to a friend at a big discount and he was able to use it. What did you think? What would you have done differently? Share your opinions in the comments. And if you enjoyed the stories, slap that like and subscribe button for more of them, and don't forget to support the original writers with an upvote. Links are in the description. Peace out, and catch you tomorrow.